and welcome along to the Property Academy podcast by Suburbs Partners. I'm your host, Steve McKnight.
And I'm Andrew Nicol.
And today on the show, we're talking about the suburbs with the fastest growing house prices. But not only that, we're going to talk about the most expensive, the cheapest suburbs in New Zealand, and also those suburbs with the highest and lowest gross yields. Now, this is one of my favorite shows of the year because we have just received the best of the best report from our friends at CoreLogic, where they rank all of the suburbs, best and worst suburbs in New Zealand by a whole range of different factors. Now, Andrew, just remind me, why is this my favorite show of the year? Why do we like to look at the best of the best report?
So we talk about property market and principles on this show, but every year this report comes out and it shows the fastest growing suburbs, it shows the cheapest suburbs, and shows the highest yielding suburbs. And we're going to talk about the principles in the show, and then this puts it into practice.
Okay, so let's talk about the suburbs that have grown in value the most throughout 2024.
Now, this is almost a Charles Dickens moment because it's a tale of two.
No, call me, you're meant to read it. Call me Charles Dickens because it's the tale of two suburbs. Please say it.
Okay. Well, call me Charles Dickens because it's a tale of two suburbs.
I don't get it.
Right, so the suburb that went up the most.
Sorry, do that again.
Now, the suburbs that went up the most were either in really rich areas or really cheap areas. Now, to give you an example, in a number 3 spot, we've got Cobden on the West Coast, which has had a 12.8% change in growth in the last 12 months.
So house prices went up almost 13% in Cobden on the West Coast. That's in Grey District.
Number 2 on the list is Kaikoura, 12.8% as well, 12.8%. And number 1 is Blaketown on the west coast of the South Island, and that went up a whopping 16.7%.
Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. And the most interesting thing is over the last couple of years when we've done this episode, Cobden and Blaketown have been basically the cheapest 2 or 3 suburbs in the top 3 cheapest suburbs in the country. And so it's interesting that, you know, a 12% or a 13% or a 17% change, that becomes a little bit easier in some of these suburbs, especially when interest rates are high, because to get a mortgage to go buy a property in Blaketown, well, your mortgage doesn't have to be that large at all because properties are relatively cheap. And just talking about that tale of 2 suburbs or tale of 2 cities, some of the suburbs that went up in value really, really quickly were in Queenstown and are very expensive. Places like Fern Hill or Lake Hayes Estate, where to buy a decent house there, it's definitely going to have, it's definitely going to be well into the 6 figures. Properties in Lake Hayes Estate, average change of 10%. So basically, house prices went up 10% in Lake Hayes over the last 12 months. It's absolutely fascinating.
It's amazing when we're talking about, you know, very little capital growth for most of the country over the last 12 months, and Blaketown has had 16%.
But let's also talk about the properties that have fallen in value the most. It's actually not just cheap properties that are going up in value. Some of them are falling in value as well. So in number 1 spot, the suburb where property values fell the most over the last 12 months, Matoda, which is in Gore down in Southland. Property values there fell 10% over the last 12 months. So that's pretty much followed up very closely by Pipitea, which is in Wellington. Property values there fell 9.9%. Now, if we look at the areas where property values fell the most, quite a number of them are in Wellington and Auckland. So places like Burswood in Auckland and also Huntington Park, we've seen property values there fall about 8% per year just over the last 12 months. So it's quite fascinating where you see this difference between where property values are going up a lot and where some are falling. So there are going to be some New Zealanders out there who are really happy with the property market at the moment. If you're in Queenstown and your multi-million-dollar property has just gone up in value by 11% over the last 12 months, you're probably feeling quite good about yourself. If, on the other hand, you're in Wellington and the value of your property has fallen by 8.7%, you probably think the property market's doing really, really poorly. So there's a tale of 2 cities in this as well, where some of us are really happy with the property market. We're seeing it booming. Some of us are seeing property prices falling quite a lot. Let's come to the most expensive and the cheapest properties in New Zealand as well, Andrew. Top spot goes, as it always does, to Herne Bay in Auckland with a median value of $3 million. and $360,000.
Huge.
Just imagine that. You drive down
You
the
get
street
the average house, and
and it's $3 million, please. Well, actually, it's more than that, $3.3 million. That's followed up by the usual suspects on here. A lot of bougie suburbs in Auckland, St Mary's Bay, that's just under 3 mil, Remuera, Westmere. Interestingly, for the first time, we've seen a non-Auckland suburb on the list of the most expensive suburbs in the country. Arrowtown, which is down in Queenstown Lakes District, that comes in at the 5th spot, average value there or median value there of just under $2.4 million. And Andrew, if we look at how those 10 most expensive suburbs are changing in value over the last year, we see that if you were in Herne Bay, you should feel pretty good about yourself as well. The average value went up by 6.2% over the last year, which, bear in mind, since the average value is over $3 million, it's almost $200K that the average value's gone up by. It's just absolutely huge money, isn't it? Let's talk about the other end of town and talk about the areas with the lowest median values.
Yeah, so there's been a change this year. So Cobden and Blaketown, which are two suburbs on the west coast, which have been on the lowest prices, on the top 10 lowest for the last, so long as I can remember, they've been knocked off their perch. So they're no longer on the list of most affordable places to buy.
Cobden's still number 7.
Oh, still number 7. Sorry, I was just checking that. But now you've got Murupara as number 1. And that's in the Whakatane, and that's $191,600. Now, just to put that into context, imagine you've got the average house in Herne Bay, and you sold that, and you took all your money, and you went to, and you go here and you buy as many properties as you can. You could buy 17 homes.
Yeah, you could basically buy a small street, the equivalent between one average Herne Bay house and 17 average houses in Murupara and Whakatane.
That's amazing, isn't it? And look, there's a lot more diversification this year where to find the cheaper properties. So Southland's got 3, Manawa 2, Whanganui has got 2, West Coast 2, Bay of Plenty 1, Northland 1, and Taranaki 1.
Yeah, so there's a lot more diversity in there, whereas previously the cheapest suburbs in the country were basically in Southland, primarily Invercargill and the West Coast, and now we're seeing it all around New Zealand. Now, there's actually a bit of benefit there for investors who specifically like to buy in really, really cheap areas. And even though we'd typically warn against that on the show, we've talked about the pros and cons against that. Andrew and I kind of fall on more of the con side. We think that there are quite a lot of risks in buying in quite small towns. There are people who listen to the show who will say, bugger those guys, I'm going to go and buy in a really cheap area anyway. And I like to renovate. I like to be hands-on. I want to buy a property that's really close to where I live. The fact that those top 10 cheapest suburbs are now all around the country, that provides a bit of opportunity to in this episode compared to what we've seen previously when we've talked about the best of the best reports. Now, one interesting thing, Andrew, is if I asked you where Murupara is, could you pick it out on a map?
No, absolutely not.
So one thing that's kind of interesting is just saying, okay, well, we know that, okay, let me ask you this. Could you pick out where Whakatane is on the map?
No.
Take a guess. Take a
No,
guess.
I'm not doing
Please,
that. I'm not doing that. I'm not doing that. No, this is an Andrew's geography lesson where you make fun of me.
Is it over here?
No.
Where is it? Is it north or south?
Go north.
North?
Yeah. Give it.
Where is it?
I'll take a stab in the dark. Here. Yeah.
That's Manawatu Wanganui. You're such a South Islander.
Yeah.
You guys always say, oh, you North Islanders, you don't know. So Whakatane's up in the Bay of Plenty and right in here. And let's see where, do you know what? I couldn't pick out Murupara on a map either. I don't know where it is.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So it's looks to be a small town in pretty rural Whakatane district. Let's just find out. I don't even know, Andrew.
Can you show me a property from there?
Yeah, no, I will show you a property from there. But I just want to know first, how many people live in Murupara? Currently about 2,000 people live there. So quite a small town, which is why the average value of a property or the median value of a property is currently under $200,000. Okay, so let's look for properties there at the moment. So here's one that has got an asking price of $255,000. 3-bedroom, 1-bathroom.
Wow.
Just describe it to everybody what we're looking at who's listening on
So
Spotify.
a very old weatherboard house with some very dated interiors.
Okay, that's probably what you'd expect for $250,000, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Holy hell.
okay, that's it. I haven't seen a stainless steel basin.
Yeah, no, nor at
and-
all. I was just thinking the exact same thing. I haven't seen one of those since the Boys Brigade camps that I'd go on.
Yeah, okay, we're going to dig into that a little later on. Okay, so it's lining up with the data. You know, we say the average value is $200K, and looking at the asking price, here's one for $230,000.
Wow.
Definitely a renovation project. It's
A renovator's dream.
yeah.
Look at the curtains.
Yeah, I wonder if it's being staged. That's a little joke.
You're such a piece of
What?
work.
Is that,
Okay, go down.
Is that gonna
DIY
make
beauty. I want to see DIY beauty. No,
Okay,
up.
DIY beauty. So we're looking at, what are we looking at here?
This
Andrew?
looks like kind of the rickety old towns of outback America that I imagine.
Yeah, and big section. We're going to get all of our audience from Murupara not like ours, Andrew, if we don't say some nice things
If
about
we
it.
have someone there, I will be absolutely amazed.
So three beds, 1 bath with 800 meters squared worth of land.
separate.
It's got a separate toilet. That's good. So CV of 155K. Yeah. So what's the homes value on it? Homes estimate of $190,000. Again, pretty much bang on what CoreLogic is telling us in terms of average values. And just looking at this property as well, this is just a really good example of what we typically talk about in small towns. Often what you see is the properties aren't just cheap because there's not many people living in Murupara, because it's in a bit more of a rural area, not a lot of industry going on there. It's also something about the quality of houses. So they typically have a lot of deferred maintenance. So this property obviously needs painting. It needs a real look at. You'd want to make sure that, you know, is the roof secure? And if you think about painting a property, it might cost you 20 grand or 10 grand if you use somebody to do it. It's probably 20 grand, isn't it, these days? Yeah. That could be 10% of your property price in this case. And so the maintenance that you've got to do is very expensive compared to the value of the asset that you're getting. And Andrew, just before we wrap up, we've got to talk about the highest and lowest yielding suburbs as well. Let's start with the highest yielding.
Well, so last year, you might remember the highest gross yielding place was Wanganui Central, which was 8.5% as the average yield. The lowest gross yield was Whitford in Auckland at a low 1.1%. That's terrible yield. I always thought Herne Bay was the worst though.
No, Whitford, according to CoreLogic's data. And it's still there actually at 1.2% gross yield for Whitford.
Okay, so still the lowest. But Matura and Gore has taken over as the highest gross yield at 10.8%.
Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. And one thing that I do just want to mention is you've got to be a bit careful when you look at data. So when I looked at it last year, we were talking about Wanganui, and the average value of a property in Wanganui was about $390,000. Now, with that gross yield, it implies a rent of about $635 a week. And if we went and looked at Whitford, which had the lowest gross yield, the average value of a property there was about $2.5 million. Now, at a 1% gross yield, that implies a rent of about $540 per week. Now, that means that under these numbers, the average property in Wanganui is getting about $100 a week extra in rent, but the value or the average value of properties is about a sixth of what it is in Whitford. So what I'm just trying to get across is I wouldn't think that, well, the average value of a property in Wanganui is $390,000, so I can buy a property for $390,000 and rent it out for $635 a week. But if I go to Whitford, I'm going to buy a $2.5 million property and rent it out for only $540 a week, right? What would actually happen in practice is those properties in Whitford that are being rented out for $540 a week, well, it's more likely that they are much, much cheaper properties. They might be 1 or 2 bedroom units. They're probably not the $2.5 million lifestyle blocks with really large houses. That might be the average property in Whitford, but the rental properties is only a small subset of that, which might be much more humble homes that rent out for much less. Effectively, what I'm saying is when you start looking at some of these tables and some of these reports, you've just got to be a little bit careful of the data and understand how it's calculated, because the way it's calculated, taking simply the average rent for an area and an average value for the area might not tell you, well, what was the actual average property? Now, the principle is probably true. Are rental properties high yielding in Wanganui or Matoda down in Gore compared to the likes of Whitford? I have no doubt about that. So it can still help inform your decision, but you also just need to be a little bit careful about the exact details of what you're getting out of it. So for example, as Andrew just said, the average yield in Whitford is 1.2%. But if you were then to go and buy a property that had a 2% gross yield in Whitford, I wouldn't then be like, that is
what a bargain.
That is the best yielding property in Whitford. That is an absolute slam dunk, because 1.2% is probably not what you should aim for. It's going to be a lot higher than that. So just be a little bit careful with how data is calculated once you start looking at these things. But all up, those are the areas that have grown in value the most over the last year. Also, those that have shrunk the most. We've talked about the most expensive, the cheapest areas, and those with the highest and lowest gross yields. Right, let's wrap it up there. But please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Really does help us get the message out to more people. And if you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, you want to see the report that we're taking you through, just Google Opus Partners YouTube. It'll be the first thing that comes up. Thanks for listening to the Property Academy podcast. I'm your host, Seb Knight.
And I'm Andrew Nicol.
We're going to be back again tomorrow with even more daily strategies, tactics, and insights to help you get the most out of the New Zealand property market. Until next time.